So what's up, internet? This is Sinus Media here, and this was not the video I was intending to make today or show. I'm working on several videos actually, and none of them are finished. But this is maybe one I'm going to get out by the end of the year. So this is a program I wrote over 20 years ago now, in the 1990s. And it's written in Visual Basic of all things. And what it is it's a kind of experimental music program, MIDI sequencer, let's say. So you have a blank, it's called Gbloink, because the things kind of bounce. So what you've got here is a kind of blank play area, and you can put a border in, but you can also put some extra blocks or obstacles in like this. But to start off, we just fill it up with a few borders and seeds, and we have three balls: a red ball, a green ball, and a blue ball. And as they bounce around, whenever they hit one of these obstacles, they fire off a MIDI note. So when you start it up, it sounds something like this. Let's speed those up a little bit. And as you put more obstacles in, the denser it becomes, of course, the more notes you will hear. And in fact, this is quite interesting. I mean, this was a very simple idea that was some kind of musical maze where something moved around inside a maze, and when it hit things, it triggered sounds, etc. Well, this one we're looking at now was a kind of simplification. In fact, I wrote this in a weekend, the original version of this. I just kind of had this idea. I thought I would implement it, and it turned out pretty well, I think, because I've been playing with it for many years. However, there are some issues with this. Now, this is written in Visual Basic. It just fires off standard MIDI. And back then, in the 90s, you had a MIDI mapper, which was a part of Windows that kind of let you say, well, where is the default MIDI synthesizer for this? Now, somewhere along the line, Microsoft took that away as an option, and you just had Microsoft's own default GM synth, which in Windows, which, let's face it, has always sounded pretty weak and not very good. In fact, in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, I had actually a better sound card, which was a kind of rompler type thing. You know, it had a mixture of samples and synthesized sound, and it sounded really good, in fact. And then Windows updated, and you couldn't automatically use that anymore, and so I kind of stopped using this. Occasionally bring it out and sort of just play around and sample it, but I'm just giving you a feel for how it sounds, right? These bars at the bottom here control the speed of the balls. These control the volumes of the balls here. So we can slow if we click further to the left, or we can speed if we click further to the right. And volume is here. So why am I showing this to you today? Well, this is a program, an idea I've had. I've been thinking about this idea for many years, and it's a powerful idea because it's a kind of random note generator, music generator, but the randomness is constrained in an interesting way by the shape of this play area. And you can interfere. You click, you can add a block, you right click, and you can take some blocks away. Now, when you draw a block or remove a block, it's always a random size and shape, which means you don't have full control over it. So when you play with this, you're always you're not playing it like an instrument. You are, or at least you have a sense of engagement the way you might with an instrument, but at the same time, it's always half out of your control and half doing something that it wants to do. And I find that a very interesting state to be in, that intermediate position between being in control and just having something randomly do. In fact, this is kind of my philosophy of artistic software, is you don't want something at one end of the spectrum which is kind of sits there in an inert way until you do something to it, or at least sometimes you might want something like that, but the interesting stuff I think doesn't just do that. And on the other hand, you don't just want it going off following its own algorithm or being random by itself. You want to have some supervision or control, or what I sometimes call semi-control. So although this is a very simple idea, the other thing to understand is the vertical position of the ball gives you the pitch. Okay, so although this is a very simple idea, I found it over the years to be a very powerful idea, and it's I've created a lot of music with this, and I've then used it in other contexts as well. So it's a great program, it's a great idea, but it's very old and outdated. And since then, I've tried several times to rewrite it in a more up-to-date form. And I have a few experiments. I have a version that runs in the browser, but it's not particularly good. I have a couple of other versions I've been working on. It's one of my long-term projects to bring this back in perhaps a more up-to-date form. It's something that's never happened yet. So, as well as the balls bouncing around here, you also have a choice of scales. We can put it into the minor. Or a more exotic Now, when I wrote this program, I knew even less about music theory than I know now. And in particular, I was so naive that I kind of thought that if you were in a minor scale, then you had to play all minor chords. So I have an option here for playing a chord instead of a single note. But if you're in the minor, all the chords are minor, and if you're in the major, so it's from a kind of traditional tonal theory, harmonic theory perspective, it's very wrong, but it can sometimes give you some interesting effects here. But it is interestingly different from a lot of other random MIDI music generation techniques. So why am I showing you this program today? Well, it's a video I've been planning to make for a while. But the thing that happened today is I discovered this CoolSoft virtual MIDI synth. And the CoolSoft virtual MIDI synth is a Windows-based sound font player. So if you have a sound font, these are kind of like free packs that are collections of general MIDI style sound. Well, I think most of them follow the general MIDI standard. That's the kind of standard 127 sounds that start with pianos and go through xylophones and celestes and then etc. up to kind of more sound effects at the 110s. And, you know, these are the Windows standard. This is a standard for many years. And of course, you can have synthesizers that play them with better quality, and Sound Font, although not a very, I believe, sophisticated synthesizer in general, it's certainly better than the built-in Windows one that we still have in Windows in 2021 by default. So I've got this synth here, and I've got something called Weeds GM3. This is a free Sound Font library. And the really exciting thing about CoolSoft, and this is why CoolSoft, or at least are now my new favorite people, is they have a MIDI mapper. So you can now go into this option here and tell it the default synth not to be the Microsoft one, but to be the virtual MIDI synth, this synth itself. Which means now, when you hear Gbloink, what you are listening to is not Microsoft's standard synth, but this new Sound Font. That's why the pianos sound a bit better. And why you'll hear we actually have some other quite nice instruments. Up to, we have, I think, choirs here. Sometimes something in which is slightly, well, when I wrote this on a computer that had a Sound Blaster card with 8 voices. So one of the things I didn't think about very much was MIDI off. I just send MIDI on notes whenever one of these balls hits the edge that it's going to bounce from, including one of the other balls. I trigger a MIDI on note, and each of these 3 balls, the red, green and blue, are on MIDI channels 1, 2 and 3, I think. One of the things I didn't think about at that time was sending a MIDI off signal. Now that was partly laziness, and partly it didn't matter very much, because when you only have 8 voices, fairly soon after you send you trigger any voice, you're going to run out of your 8 voices, and it's going to steal that first voice again and reuse it next time you play a note. So when I was using it on that old 8-voice synthesizer, the fact that I didn't send any MIDI off made very little difference, because obviously all the sounds are going to finish fairly soon. But when you start using this on a more sophisticated synthesizer with more voices, then the fact that for longer sounds like this choir sound or a string sound or any continuous sound, you're not sending a MIDI. It's got its release value is more than 0, means that you're just going to kind of end up with a continuous sound. So the other reason that I wasn't sending the MIDI off is that it's a little bit difficult to decide when to send it. It's not like on a piano, if you think about it, it's when you hit the piano key, the MIDI on note messages are sent, and when you release the piano key, the MIDI off messages are sent. On this, though, I just have these balls bouncing around this play area, and when they hit, I send the MIDI on. But when should I send the MIDI off? Should I send it immediately afterwards? Well, if I send it immediately afterwards, then the note stops too quickly for many sounds. You just got to kind of blip. But if I don't send it off at all, then the notes that have any kind of release greater than 0 end up playing continuously. So I ended up implementing a very simple mechanism I call here solo, which when we play a note, it remembers for a short period of time and then turns it off again, or sends the note off for it. It was a simplistic mechanism, and it doesn't work with, I never implemented it properly to work with the poly mode, which lets you play more than one. So you can define an instrument as a solo instrument here, and you can have it turn itself off shortly after, so play the note off shortly after it plays. And for many of these voices, you actually need to use the solo mode, the solo mode. So you need to set it to be, it's the green one that's playing that choir. Put it to pentatonic. So this is the next interesting thing to note. If you look at this red ball here, it's fallen into a loop. So there's no idea of a time or bars or sort of measures or patterns in this. Notes just play whenever they hit things, but the balls hit the obstacles. But the balls can fall into a cycle, like you can see this red ball doing here. I may just experiment with some other sounds and see. And that can obviously give you now a sort of repetitive pattern that underpins everything else. Of course, you might be able to get more than one ball to fall into a loop as well. Let's see if we can. What I'm thinking of doing is I'm putting this piano, I'm putting this blue ball back to playing a sort of piano-like thing. I want to get it down the screen a bit and see if I can get it playing some sort of loop as well. Let's speed it up a bit. So you can now hear that blue ball. You can now hear the blue ball is doing its kind of slightly faster groove there. So these are not in sync with each other, but you are getting them kind of phasing against each other interestingly. Let's try a different sound for that. This white ball is a has some extra abilities which I won't go into here, and it acts as an obstacle. So you can see how it's fairly straightforward to build up something quite interesting and unexpected with this program. And as I say, I've had a lot of fun with it. I've certainly found it a very productive thing to both work with, to make music, and to think about why it works, in my opinion, so well. For an idea which was a fairly simple idea when I came up with it. And as I say, I'm very, very happy today to discover this cool soft virtual MIDI synth, which both is a fairly decent sound font playing synth for Windows, but particularly gives you this MIDI mapper control, which Microsoft just took out of Windows for no apparently good reason back in 2005 or whatever, whenever after XP. The problem is that I've actually lost. I no longer have the development environment I used to work on this. So I do have the source code somewhere, but I don't think I can actually edit or change this program anymore because I don't have Visual Basic 6 or whatever it was written in. And I was also using somebody's MIDI library at the time I got from elsewhere, a little sort of ActiveX component or something, or long time ago this. So I'm really chuffed. I'm really happy to have this program on my machine working well with better sounds. And it and now if I just find a good sound font, I can use it with that. Let's just put this back into a different. It's almost like you're improvising with a trio of musicians and you're kind of giving them instructions, sort of high level instructions. You're not telling them what notes to play, but you're sort of saying, go into this area and play that, play a dense cluster of notes there because I'm going to constrain you within a small space or a space with a lot of obstacles. Or on the other hand, no, I want you to go slower and just be in this big open area where you're going to play only a few things. Right, something interesting is happening now. That white ball has gone into the space where the red ball is. It's going to disrupt it. It may even knock it out of this space. So all by itself, it's decided that we're not going to have that repetitive sax pattern anymore. Now that red one is going to go out and do a little bit of a solo of its own, or a more freer improvisation of its own. So we might make the green one a bit quieter to give the red one some space. You'll notice when it goes through this horizontal passage, you get like a trill. This red one is actually in a longer loop, you see. It's still repeating itself, but over this much longer pathway through the play area. But once it hits that white wall, that path will get disrupted again. The other thing you'll probably notice is some pretty awful lag, right, between what you're seeing on the screen and the sounds that are being played. In fact, I'm not even sure if the lag is that way around. It almost feels somehow that the ball is late. What you're seeing is later than the sound, but that is somehow a modern thing. That in the back in the 1990s, the latency was actually a lot less than this. There was a tiny bit of latency. You could see a kind of slight gap, but actually it wasn't as bad as that. Back then, when the ball hit it, the sound happened fairly close to that ball hitting it. So that is Gbloink, and like I say, it's old program that I've worked on many years ago and come back to every now and then to play with. But I am really happy to have discovered this virtual synth with the MIDI mapper. The final bonus for me, and in some ways this is even more exciting, if I just put all this back to being slow, is this MIDI mapper also will let me map to the Loop B internal thing. Now I have to close this down and run it again, but now the MIDI is going out to Loop B, and if you remember, Loop B is actually the thing that goes to FL Studio. So I'm going to put my border back here. Let's go into FL Studio and let's put in something like Flex with a Essential Pianos, Electric Piano Bright, Electric Piano, let's see. So one of the problems with FL Studio is that it doesn't really understand MIDI channels. I mean, I don't know why ImageLine decided to do this, but as far as FL Studio is concerned, everything coming in is coming in on the same channel. And so, as far as I can tell anyway, so when I which means we cannot have these three different instruments. We don't have a multi-timbral synthesizer at this point. If I play this now, it's sending these notes to now. This is something I have literally never had working for me before until today, which is Gbloink talking or sending MIDI into FL Studio to let me play FL Studio synthesizers. And so even though there is this restriction that it's not able to distinguish these three channels, at least as far as I can tell, I don't think I'm going to be able to make it do that. But even so, it's exciting, because what we can do now is we can record the MIDI. So let's just make ourselves a nice long pattern here and go into song mode. And now let's record notes and automation, and okay, yeah, there it is. I'm going to make these solo though. Slow it down a little bit. It's nice when they go down these sort of chimneys and you get a kind of run. Wasn't quite hoping for that. Speed that green up a bit. So that gives us now some material. Now the problem is, again, there's no noteOff information in this. So what we can do is we set this here, and I believe it's Control L, shrinks it all to the kind of lowest. But we have captured that MIDI data, and obviously we can use it now for now what I'm going to do, let's put a bit of, where's this famous new reverb that, oh yeah, the vintage chorus that the new version of FL Studio has. I'll just put a bit of overdrive on that first. Sometimes it works quite well if you put this up here. Yeah, you see this part with those runs, make it just slightly longer for everything, I think, and randomize that. That was Alt R, now Alt X puts that, spreads out the velocities a bit more. Take the offset down a bit. Accept that. Now I had to. I may pull the speed down now. So yeah, there you have it, an instant way to generate quite a lot of MIDI material, or you could record directly from the synth if you can capture from the synth. And so yeah, it's really all thanks to these people, Coolsoft, who provided this great virtual MIDI synth that also has a MIDI mapper built in. So they do the MIDI mapper separately as well if you don't want the synth. Very, very, for me, an incredibly useful thing. I'm probably going to go and give them a donation and recommend that if you like this, you do too. But it's certainly, the site is pretty terrible. It's full of adverts and things. But the software is great. It now takes this almost 25-year-old piece of software. I guess that's what we call vintage these days. I mean, maybe this is coming up to being a classic. Yeah. I don't know. It's going to take this old thing. It's a great idea. I mean, I really, really found this idea very inspiring in my in my musical life. I mean, when I wrote this, before I wrote this program, I was making very different sort of music, and this kind of changed. This was an experiment that kind of pushed me into making a whole lot of music using it that was very different from the previous music I'd been making. It changed a little bit how I thought about music, and it's kind of clunky. It's kind of got all these mistakes in it, like the fact that had I known and understood, I knew even less then about musical theory than I know now. And had I known a little bit more, I would have not done these kind of crazy things like, oh, if we're in the minor key, all the chords must be minor chords. But that's what I did. So that's where, so that gives it a character of its own. That should still work with this. You can hear that echo, you can hear those other effects. Instant ambience. Yeah, what was I saying? I'm really happy with these people, Coolsoft, for taking this old idea and giving it, making it usable to me now in my current setup in 2020, still 2021 right now, in a way that I haven't really kind of been excited by it and used it for about 10 years, but yeah, it's really good. So this is going to be the first video I do about this program. I'm going to make a video in future, at least one more video, that's going to be about my further attempts to rewrite it in the different, I've tried it in JavaScript, I've done it in Java. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I did it in those other systems and perhaps show you some code for that. I have even thought of trying to do it in Protoplug, which is still something I might try. But even in Protoplug, you kind of have the same problem. I mean, the big issue in FL Studio is how can you have multi-temporality, and that's the tricky thing, which you kind of have for free in the old version, just using this off-the-shelf virtual MIDI synth. But yeah, so this was being an introduction to Gbloink. I will of course leave a link to the site. There is a whole site dedicated to it. You can find there are albums, you can try the kind of work in progress on the JavaScript version, although currently I, I I would recommend, if you're interested in this, actually downloading the download the new desktop app. Yeah, there was one, but I would recommend downloading like the original 1.5, which is, I've had reports that 1.8 doesn't always work for some reason that I don't know. Again, I can't fix this stuff. This was written 25 years ago. I don't have the environment to do it. So what you're looking at there is 1.5. That's what I recommend you playing with. In the browser, it kind of works, but it's not as exciting somehow. And this, there is a Java version I wrote in processing. Again, not really as interesting as the original so far. But check out the site. Check out the music, see if you like the music. The music's available on Spotify and Bandcamp and stuff. Links are all here. So I'll put this link in the description of the video. I'll put the link to Coolsoft, who are cool, in the video. There will be another Gbloink video where I talk more about writing a new version. But for the moment, I've now discovered it's quite a viable thing to play with and use in Windows in 2021 with your DAW. So I leave you with that. Remember, you need that Loop B virtual MIDI driver as well in Windows, or an equivalent, in order to drive for one MIDI program in Windows to drive another one. Okay, that's it. Since Media, and I'm out.